At this point, almost everyone knows someone on a GLP-1 drug like Ozempic, Wegovy, or Mounjaro. A colleague, a family member, a friend who suddenly lost a lot of weight and looks, well, different. Celebrities are openly using them. Influencers are quietly using them. And unrealistic body standards, already amplified by social media, are pouring gasoline on the fire. For some people, these drugs really do feel like a miracle. For others, they feel unsettling. And for many, they raise a deeper question. Are drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy a medical breakthrough, a cultural phenomenon, a longevity tool, or maybe all three? Today, I want to step back and talk about what these drugs really are, how they work, what they're good at and what they're not, and where they may fit into the future of aging and healthspan. So this isn't about hype, and it's not about moralizing weight loss. It's about biology. And today, on the Reprogram Podcast, we're going to unpack the science, the culture, and the consequences of Ozempic and related drugs, and what they may mean for the future of aging. Welcome, and remember, knowledge is power. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Reprogram Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. George Murphy. If you're new here, the Reprogram is a podcast about extending healthspan, how we can live longer, healthier lives by understanding biology, aging, and resilience, and by separating what the science actually shows from what's hype. So before diving in, I want to reframe today's topic. When most people hear Ozempic or Wegovy, they think weight loss. But that framing is far too narrow. These are not just weight loss drugs. They are neuroendocrine drugs, that sounds complicated, that act upstream, reprogramming how the brain and body regulate energy, hunger, and nutrient handling. That upstream effect is why they feel so powerful and why they're not easily replaced by willpower alone. So, first and foremost, how widespread is the use of GLP-1 drugs? So in 2020, only a few million people in the US were on these drugs, mainly as countermeasures for diabetes. In 2025, however, cue widespread adoption, that number is now 30 million people. That means a whopping 12% of US adults report that they are currently taking a GLP-1 drug. And now, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly are engaged in a rapid arms race. The approval of oral Wegovy, the GLP-1 pill you've probably just heard about, represents a major shift by lowering barriers to access and reducing stigma. So while oral formulations may not yet match injectable efficacy, they do represent a major shift in how these drugs may be used in the future. So importantly, these drugs did not appear out of nowhere. Their rapid adoption tells us something profound about modern biology, but also about modern life. In just a few years, these drugs have achieved a level of cultural saturation that typically takes decades. So this really does tell us something critical. GLP-1 drugs did not create a metabolic crisis. They revealed how widespread metabolic dysfunction already was. Next, what exactly are GLP-1 drugs and what are they not? So GLP-1 stands for, get ready, glucagon-like peptide 1. That sounds complicated, but basically it's a hormone naturally released from the gut in response to your food intake. It plays a central role in things like appetite regulation, insulin secretion, blood sugar control, and gastric emptying. Basically and simply, GLP-1 drugs amplify these signals, and they work by reprogramming energy regulation. So when people hear about drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy, they usually think about weight loss. But to understand why these drugs are so powerful, we have to understand where they act in the body. So these are not drugs that work downstream by burning calories or speeding up your metabolism. They work upstream at the level of biological control systems. So GLP-1 is a hormone, as we said, that your gut naturally releases when you eat. Under normal conditions, it acts as a kind of messenger, telling the rest of your body that nutrients are coming in and that it's time to adjust. So GLP-1 drugs amplify that message and they send it to multiple organs at once, which is really interesting. First, they act on the brain. In the brain, GLP-1 receptors are found in regions that regulate things like hunger, satiety, and reward. When these receptors are activated, the brain interprets this as enough food has arrived. Your appetite decreases, cravings quiet down, and the constant background drive to eat, what many people describe as food noise, is reduced. That's why these drugs don't feel like dieting. They change the signal, not the willpower. Second, they act on the pancreas. GLP-1 drugs increase insulin secretion only when glucose is present. So this is a critical point where they can improve blood sugar control without the same risk of hypoglycemia that was seen with older diabetes drugs. Third, they act on the gut itself. They slow gastric emptying, meaning food stays in the stomach longer. This reinforces satiety and smooths out blood sugar spikes after meals. And finally, they act on the body as a whole. By coordinating signals between the gut, brain, pancreas, and peripheral tissues, GLP-1 drugs shift the body into a state where energy intake is lower, glucose handling is improved, and metabolic stress is reduced. So all of this is why calling these drugs weight loss drugs really does miss the point. They are, again, neuroendocrine energy regulation drugs. That sounds complicated, but basically it simply means they don't force the body to lose weight. They reprogram the instructions the body is operating under. And that upstream intervention is why they feel so powerful and why they raise important questions when we start talking about aging. Okay, so weight loss is the most visible effect of GLP-1 drugs, but it's not the most important one. Weight is what we see. Metabolism is what's actually changing. And this distinction matters because if we focus on the number on the scale, we completely miss why these drugs are so powerful and why they've changed the conversation around obesity and metabolic disease. So, at a metabolic level, GLP-1 drugs improve blood sugar control. They reduce triglycerides. They lower blood pressure. They dampen systemic inflammation. And they do this in a coordinated way, like we talked about, across multiple organ systems. So that constellation of effects helps explain something that surprised a lot of people early on. These drugs reduce cardiovascular events too, not because people are thinner, but because their metabolic physiology is fundamentally different. So the body is handling glucose differently. Insulin signaling is more effective. Post-meal spikes are blunted. Inflammatory tone is lower. These are aging-relevant changes, and this is where GLP-1 drugs force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. For decades, obesity has been framed as a failure of discipline, a problem of willpower, motivation, or personal responsibility. But GLP-1 drugs expose how incomplete that story is. When you pharmacologically change appetite signaling, satiety, and nutrient handling, people eat less, not because they're trying harder, but because their biology is telling them something different. This tells us that body weight is not simply a behavioral outcome. It's a regulated biological state. And once you accept that, the conversation shifts. The question is no longer, why don't people just eat less? The question becomes, what signals are driving energy intake, storage, and metabolic stress in the first place? So GLP-1 drugs don't just make people lighter. They make people metabolically quieter. And that metabolic quieting reduced glucose volatility, reduced insulin demand, reduced inflammatory burden is likely far more important for long-term health than weight loss alone. This is why focusing exclusively on weight misses the point. Weight loss is the surface phenomenon. Metabolic reprogramming is the deeper effect. And it's the deeper effect that matters for disease risk, cardiovascular outcomes, and potentially for how we think about aging itself. This brings us to one of the most interesting and most controversial questions that surround GLP-1 drugs. Are they geroprotectors? So a geroprotector is an intervention that improves healthspan, not by targeting a single disease, but by buffering the biological processes that drive aging itself. Things like metabolic stress, chronic inflammation, cellular damage, and loss of physiological resilience, things that we've talked about in other episodes of the Reprogram Podcast. By that definition, GLP-1 drugs clearly do something relevant. They reduce cardiovascular risk. They improve kidney outcomes. They lower systemic inflammation, and they also appear to improve metabolic signaling across multiple organs, as we discussed. These are not cosmetic effects. These are pathways deeply implicated in aging biology. So cardiovascular disease, kidney dysfunction, metabolic syndrome, and chronic inflammation are among the most powerful drivers of morbidity and mortality as we age. Interventions that meaningfully reduce stress on these systems can, at a minimum, reshape the trajectory of late life disease. There's also growing interest in the brain itself. So insulin signaling plays a critical role in brain function too. Metabolic dysfunction and glucose dysregulation are increasingly recognized as contributors to cognitive decline and neurodegenerative diseases. By improving insulin sensitivity and reducing metabolic volatility, GLP-1 drugs may indirectly reduce neuroinflammatory stress and improve neuronal resilience. So what does that mean? I.e., they may be preventative against things like Alzheimer's disease, and that's really cool. So that's an area of active investigation and one that deserves caution, not hype. So are GLP-1 drugs longevity drugs too? We don't know. There is currently no evidence that these drugs extend maximal lifespan. They've not been shown to slow the fundamental molecular hallmarks of aging in a way that caloric restriction, rapamycin, or genetic interventions do in model organisms. Again, something we've discussed in past episodes of the podcast. But longevity is not a binary outcome. Remember that. GLP-1 drugs may buy time by delaying the onset of age-related disease, and they may improve resilience by reducing the metabolic and inflammatory burden placed on tissues over decades. They may compress morbidity, even if they don't extend lifespan itself. And that distinction really does matter. It would be irresponsible to call GLP-1 drugs anti-aging therapies, but it would also be short-sighted to ignore their potential to reshape healthspan in a population-level way. What they offer is not immortality, but the possibility of a longer period of metabolic stability, functional independence, and reduced disease burden. And in the context of aging, that may be powerful enough. But, of course, we can't talk honestly about GLP-1 drugs without talking about their drawbacks. So weight loss on these drugs is not purely fat loss. There is real loss of lean tissue, including skeletal muscle. And this matters profoundly for aging. So this isn't a minor side effect. It's central to long-term health. If you've noticed that people you know who are on these drugs sometimes look different, not just leaner, but smaller, more fragile, or almost deflated, what you're often seeing is muscle loss. Faces look sharper, shoulders narrow. Strength fades quietly in the background. So this isn't about appearance, it's about tissue. And skeletal muscle is not an expendable tissue. Muscle is not just for movement. It actually is a metabolic organ itself. Skeletal muscle acts as a glucose sink, pulling sugar out of the bloodstream and buffering blood glucose excursions after meals. It improves insulin sensitivity. It stabilizes metabolism. People with more muscle handle metabolic stress better and age more resiliently. But muscle does more than regulate blood sugar. Muscle protects the brain. It protects the heart. It protects independence. So loss of muscle increases frailty, fall risk, insulin resistance, and loss of functional capacity. All terrible things. Sarcopenia is one of the strongest predictors of morbidity, institutionalization, and mortality in older adults. So when muscle is lost, the body becomes metabolically fragile, even if the scale says healthy. And here's the key contrast. GLP-1 drugs work by suppressing appetite and reducing energy intake, right? Without resistance training and sufficient protein, that reduction in intake creates the perfect conditions for muscle loss. The drugs don't distinguish between fat and muscle. Biology does what biology does. So muscle, on the other hand, adapts. Unlike drugs, muscle responds to stress by getting stronger. It improves its ability to take up glucose, to oxidize fat, and buffer inflammation. Muscle compounds. Once built, it continues to protect metabolic health, resilience, and independence over time. So this does not mean GLP-1 drugs are bad. It means they are incomplete. For some people, pharmacology may be necessary to reduce metabolic load and disease risk. But for many others, preserving and building skeletal muscle may be a more powerful first-line longevity intervention than simple drugs alone. So the best outcomes will likely come from combining pharmacology with resistance training. So using drugs to quiet metabolic stress while actively protecting the tissue that makes long-term health possible. Because muscle is not vanity. Muscle is protective biology. So to summarize, GLP-1 drugs are powerful tools. They reveal how broken modern metabolism has become and offer meaningful relief to millions. But they are not replacements for biology or for hard work in the gym, for that matter. The future of aging will not be drugs or lifestyle. It will be knowing when and how to use each. That is what reprogramming really means. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion. So please follow our podcast and join me on this journey of understanding and self-discovery as we navigate our way into the fields of longevity, aging biology, regenerative medicine, and the emerging field of geroscience.